We're continuing in John chapter 4. In this passage, as I think about, I know it's a silly play on words, but maybe it'll stick with us with this faith lift. John chapter 4 is early in Jesus' ministry as we continuing in the following the life of Christ, studying the four Gospels. We've been in John for a little bit. John deals with the public ministry side of Jesus a lot more frequently than some of the other four Gospels. That's why we're spending a little more time in it. But if you've paid attention, John chapter 4, as I said, there's not much that Jesus has done, but there's also much to be accomplished. At this point, the rumors of Jesus would have started to spread around a little bit, and we see some evidence of this, that people knew that Jesus was up to some things that were, if they weren't miraculous, they were quite amazing, what he was doing. Either that or he was a really good magician. Some people just hadn't figured out what to do with Jesus yet. And so I want us to read through this passage. It's John 4, 43 through 54. And as we read it, remember last week. Remember he had just spent time with the Samaritan woman at the well, as well as he had spent time in Samaria for 2 more days at the request of the Samaritans. If you remember last week, that's a fascinating request. He shouldn't have spent any time there. They avoided this town. Good Jews would have avoided it at all costs. It was not worth the stop. It was worth it to go far around, but Jesus had just spent 2 days there. So when you read verse 43, let your mind wander to that thought. At the end of the 2 days, Jesus went on to Galilee. He himself had said that a prophet is not honored in his own hometown. Yet the Galileans welcomed him, for they had been in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration and had seen everything he did there. As he traveled through Galilee, he came to Cana, where he had turned the water into wine. There was a government official in nearby Capernaum, whose son was very sick. When he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged him to come to Capernaum to heal his son, who was about to die. Jesus asked, "Will you never believe in me unless you see miraculous signs and wonders?" The official pleaded, "Lord, please come now before my little boy dies." Then Jesus told him, "Go back home. Your son will live." And the man believed what Jesus said and started home. While the man was on his way, some of his servants met him with the news that his son was alive and well. He asked them when the boy had begun to get better, and they replied, "Yesterday afternoon at 1:00, his fever suddenly disappeared." Then the father realized that this was the very time Jesus had told him, "Your son will live." And he and his entire household believed in Jesus. This was the second miraculous sign Jesus did in Galilee after coming from Judea. This is the scripture passage of emphasis. These are the words of Jesus today for us to ponder and to reflect on. And we don't have but just a snippet of a conversation. It feels too short because I'm guessing it probably felt a little bit short when it happened. There are moments when I know Jesus is the Messiah. I know he is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But sometimes I think, that sounded a little bit snippy. I don't know. Shouldn't you have said a little bit more, Jesus? It's hard to read this and know the context and know the area and know what was happening. Well, as we gather our thoughts, consider that Jesus has really started to break the cycle. He made decisions that would have gone against society norm. He made a decision to say, I'm going to minister to this woman at the well with the intention that she would go back and tell the village. Bringing into play, or henceforth, he was entering into the world of public ministry, not just to the people of Israel, but to the surrounding nations, somewhat known as enemies, or at least people you just didn't talk about. This is a really silly illustration, but I'm sure each one of us remembers this from our childhood or high school or wherever we were back in the good old days. But does anybody remember playing for a local high school? It didn't matter if you were the chess club or if you were the football team. Does anybody remember when you played the town that was right next door? Do you remember the words that came out of your mouth or your coach's mouth? It was like, they are enemy number one. I don't know if you had a coach as similar to mine, but it was like, we cannot lose to these guys. And I didn't know anything about these guys, but I didn't like them. Never met a single one of them, but that was where my heart was at. It was like, I'm going to destroy and defeat and win, because we have to win. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. That's how you feel. How preposterous. But this is what we do, and we celebrate it all across the nation and all of our professional sports and all the different things. But as I imagine this, Jesus broke through the barrier of ministering to people in Samaria. The woman at the well yelled all around town. Everybody started in an uproar of, who is this Jesus? They all go walking out to encounter Jesus, to meet Jesus. And beyond that, they say, won't you stay? Won't you come into town? Don't just stay at the well. Come on in. And he spends 2 days there. And then we pick up the story here. After spending 2 days there, he begins to travel. He's going from Galilee to Cana. And it's hard to estimate who this nobleman or this government official truly was. There's good speculation in here. I just want to capture your mind a little bit. It's not that this is 100% accurate, but there's good evidence that it would have been something similar to this. In the Greek, he would have been a basilika, who was known as someone who belongs to a king. So when you look at the root word, someone who belongs to a king, who would that have been? That would take us back to someone like the son of Herod, that had been the one that had tried to kill all the boys when Jesus was born. His son, Herod Antipas, would have been on the throne at that time. So there's actually good speculation, if you walk this out, that he could have been a government official in Tiberias under Herod Antipas. It's just kind of fun to imagine that, but that's a ways away. So Jesus, as I said, is starting out in his ministry. He really hasn't traveled very far, but news is beginning to spread. This is actually 20 miles in a direction. If you go to Tiberias, Jesus didn't do any public ministry there. He never set foot in it, ever. So you have this as story. If this is truly where he was from, this means that commuters that are going from town to town, place to place, had begun talking about Jesus already. What also captivates my mind is the fact that this wasn't very far into Jesus' public ministry. He hadn't done a whole lot. I mean, he'd done some stuff that I'll never do. I'm not saying like it was like wimpy or something. He was amazing. He was God's son. He was revealing his glory, but he hadn't done some of the big ones that we talk about in Sunday school, that we draw pictures when we get our crayons out, because it's time to color in the 5,000, the fish and loaves, and all the good stories. He hadn't gotten there yet. He had changed water into wine, and what happened here? We read about this. It says that Jesus was, I'm sure he was reflecting about this. He said that he was not, a prophet is not welcomed in his own hometown, and yet they were communicating about him. They were somewhat welcoming him, because what had he done at the Passover celebration a little while back? He had turned water into wine, and the news had spread, and my guess is the people were beginning to talk about him, were beginning to wander out into the streets when they heard he was coming by, because just to catch a sight of Jesus. I mean, if I told you, some of you wouldn't care at all, but if I told you that like LeBron James was walking on our sidewalk right now, my guess is most of us would get up and go to the windows. If not, run outside to say hello. If you see a celebrity, it's kind of like, really? Are you serious? I mean, it kind of stops whatever you're doing. And they were flocking towards Jesus. And LeBron James is, I'm just kidding. I just wanted to mess with you. No, he's not out there. Maybe Russell Wilson. Doesn't he have the day off? I don't know. What has he got? But anyway, if you saw something like this, you would have run to him. And this is what's happening for Jesus. People are beginning to be fascinated with him, but not believe in him. There's a big difference. When we encounter this story with the government official, there's a lot of things that indicate to us that he really didn't know a whole lot about Jesus. And yet, he went. I don't know if you've ever experienced a loved one, a family member, a child perhaps, a parent perhaps, that has been on their deathbed. When you try to minister to them, all you want to do is to help them, heal them, fix them. And I imagine this government official, it doesn't matter what your rank and title is, you lose people that you love. And he was losing his son. It didn't matter that there was speculation that Jesus was in Galilee traveling the road towards Cana. It didn't matter that that was 20 miles away. When your son is dying, you get the horses ready, you pack a bag. I heard there's a guy that maybe, just maybe, could heal my son. Let's go. He drops everything. Why? Because losing your son, it's the end. I can't lose my son. And you can feel that this man risked it all on a guy who had just done a couple of miracles. And he thought, just maybe I can talk to him. Maybe he can heal my son. Maybe. All he has to go on is what he's heard. He's not seen. And what happens in this story is also quite fascinating, because what he has to go with is what he is told. He doesn't know. If you get told your son is healed, go on home, but your son's not with you, and it's a 20-mile walk, or if you have a horse or some sort of an animal to ride, that's at least a day's travel if you're pushing it. If you're walking, you're going to be doing some jogging in there. That's a long way to go. So he didn't get confirmation. He had to have faith that God was going to do something, and in fact did do something. But there's also indicators here that he is trusting, and he's speaking of authority towards Jesus, which should not have been granted to Jesus. To the locals, Jesus would have been called a teacher, a rabbi, a good guy. To his disciples, maybe they hadn't tried to define him. We haven't seen the conversation yet between Jesus and the disciples where they say, "Who do you say I am?" and they define it as the Messiah. The word was still out. We're not sure who this guy is. Maybe he's a prophet. Maybe he's a miracle worker. I love in verse 49 what takes place, because he says, Lord, which is, don't miss that word. To declare someone is Lord, that means they're your superior officer, the highest rank. For a government official who sits under Herod Antipas, that's blasphemous to call Jesus Lord. We've already gotten into some dicey ground here. This man is risking it all with his travels, but from what he's heard, if this truly is the Messiah, if he can truly do these things, then I'm going to call him Lord. Don't miss it. Please come now before my little boy dies. You see, he went and said, please come, my son is dying. And Jesus' response, I could take it as snippy, but it's not. In fact, it's quite fascinating that his words are so few. He says, go back home. Your son will live. His words were so few, and that if it was Jesus talking to me, it would be helpful if Jesus would communicate shorter sentences, because then I can remember it. But he says it very clearly, go back home, your son will live. And I love when he's almost home. I don't know how far his servants had ran. I don't know how far if they were out of breath, but they said, your son lives. Basically the exact same words that Jesus had told him the day before. And when he hears this, he investigates it further. When? When did my son live? When did he come back to life? When was his sickness released? When did he stop suffering? I don't know what exactly his son was going through, but when did it happen? It happened at 1:00. And in my mind, it's this communication. His brain immediately whips back to the conversation with Jesus. I don't know if he marked it he took account of when Jesus said it, but if you're like any good parent and you remember when you start seeing God's miracles at play, you remember, that's exactly the moment that Jesus said that to me yesterday. Can you see how his faith would have been restored? And a new faith in God began. And Jesus didn't even come. And then what happens? Because his son lived, because he recognized the miraculous event that had happened, his whole household became followers of Jesus in that moment. That is a beautiful thing to consider, to reflect on. And this is the second miraculous sign that happened in Galilee. And so it's fascinating and beautiful that Jesus has only just begun, but people are continuously being reminded of how powerful and good he is. So I have 2 points that I want us to reflect on. The first point, that there are signs and wonders. Jesus' rebuke, I'm calling it that because there's not a great word. It's easy for me to think that he was just communicating to the nobleman or the government official, whatever your translation takes it as. But what he also does, if you look back, is in verse 48, in different translations, they use more of a plural term. Or if you were from the South, it'd be like saying y'all, but it doesn't say that. But it's the plural sense of you all. Will you all never believe in me unless you see miraculous signs and wonders? So I imagine that this was a conversation with the government official, the nobleman. It's a 1-to-1. Maybe he ran from the side and came up and encountered Jesus. Maybe he was working through the crowd and said, where is this Jesus? I need to speak with him immediately. However this encounter happens, Jesus communicates the way it sounds in more of a plural sense, that all of these people that had followed from Samaria, if any of them started following, these people that had come out from Galilee or Cana, that knew of the water to wine, and the Samaritans who knew of the knowing everything about the woman at the well, I'm imagining there's quite a gathering. There's quite a herd of people that are moving when this encounter happens with this man. So the word wasn't necessarily just to this nobleman, it was also to everyone. If you're following a preacher that is out there and he's walking along and it's been told to you that he could do these miracles, you're following along. I've been there too. I want to see a miracle. And when Jesus speaks to everyone, he says, you all just want a miracle. You're waiting for a miracle. But he was getting to their heart. Will you believe in Jesus? Not just because you have seen, but because you're ready to have great faith. Not just because you've heard, but because you know. The faith that we're being called into here is beautiful. I also want us to look back and reflect on the nobleman had notoriety in society. He could have said things in more of an official way, like demanding Jesus to do these things. But Jesus responds to him, yes, I know you need a miracle, but what I want you to know is that it's time for you to go back home because your son will live. It's like when we say to someone, come follow me. We want them to join in. We want them to be encouraged. We want them to see what Jesus is up to. But Jesus is asking us to go and have great faith. Do we see the connection? The nobleman wants Jesus to come, but Jesus tells us to go. A quick picture and a reminder is that when the Samaritan woman was informed that someday we won't worship on these mountains, but in fact the time is now here where we will worship the Messiah who can be worshiped anywhere. Jesus didn't say anything about following her. She went and she told everyone. She wasn't ready to run and then said, Jesus, you got to come with me. I've got to show you off to everybody. She went out of faith and told. Has anybody ever caught yourself in this situation? You don't have to raise your hand. In fact, probably don't, because it would be embarrassing. I could raise my hand. I'll take the blame for this. But when I was growing up, I used to think, I can't share my faith. I need some help. It was like, I'll invite them to church, and then my pastor can preach at them for a while. I can invite them to youth group, and then my youth pastor can teach them. I can do these things, but I don't want to tell them. No, that's not my job. I just got to get them there. But I'm wondering if you need to hear this today. You don't need to bring Jesus with you so you can show him off. You need to go and tell people about your relationship with Jesus. It's a simple step. Nobody can take your relationship with Jesus. If it's real, then let it be real in your life. So this is the type of faith lift that I'm asking us to consider. The second element is, what kind of faith lift do you need today? The proof that what we're asking for is that your life would be changed. Your choices do define you, but will you be known for taking God-sized risks because you trust in Jesus? Or will you be defined as somebody who always plays it safe? It's easy to play it safe, but it's kind of crazy when you think about, wow, that person had so much faith that they were willing to step out, even when it didn't make sense. I can't tell you how many times when I choose the safe route. And there's reasons why you could define it. The safe route, it sounds easy, it sounds wise. It's like your parents are still speaking in your ear, be safe, be safe, be safe. But when you look at some of the biggest moments in the Bible, and specifically testimonies of those who serve in the mission field, do you think anybody's whispering in their ear, be safe, be safe, be careful, be careful, be careful, stop it. You might hurt somebody, you might offend somebody. Stop it, be careful. Now, as hard as it is to say, when we have faith, when we believe in Jesus and we trust that he carries us into eternity, whether it's today or in 50 years, I don't want to look back on my life and say, I'm just so glad I played it safe. I want to look back and say, that was a risk that was worth it for the kingdom of God. Are we willing to take risks, my friends? When Jesus speaks the word to the nobleman, his word was enough. He had faith, and his faith was confirmed in the life of his son. And when his faith was confirmed, his life was radically changed. And when his life was radically changed, his whole household was radically changed. And I can imagine, we don't have the next layer, but I'm guessing his neighborhood was entirely changed. as a result of having faith in Jesus. And now Jesus didn't go there, but this man who gets no name, just known as the government official that had a son that was healed, I don't know, let's call him Bob. That sounds like a good name. God did this in his life, and we don't even know who he was. And my guess is Tiberius had an explosion of conversions of people that started following God as a result of this man's faith. Beautiful. Now, what I want us to continue this thought in our minds is, rather than focusing on just this healing, rather than just thinking about how, well, of course he believed, his son was healed. I know there are things in this room that you've been praying for years, months, years, decades. Sometimes I don't understand God's timing. I wish that some of our prayer requests would be answered today, but I don't get it. But at the same time, I also want to be full of faith that in spite of some of my prayer requests not being answered, I have to recognize that whenever I read Scripture, it's not God that's wrong. It's me that's wrong. Every time I look at it, God's timing is always right. There's never a moment where I could be like, well, God was late. No, God does it on his timing, and it doesn't always make sense. But that's because I have a limited perspective. There are moments when I do a funeral and I think, why now? Why would this person die now? But then I also think to myself, this is an opportunity to minister to the family with a need, and they recognize that death and dying is always going to happen, but life and hope and peace and joy will not come unless we recognize our need for God. And sometimes it takes a death for us to be awoken to how we should really be living. When I ask this question and look at these things, I ask myself, what kind of faith do I aspire to have? Or what should you be considering saying yes to that is a faith yes rather than a safe yes? There are opportunities that come my way. I'm sure there are some that come your way as well. There are really great things that I can say a safe yes to. I can make that decision. That's a safe yes. You know when it's a faith yes, though? It causes us to go, whoa, I can't see the solution here. I don't know how that'll work out. And I have things in my life right now that have been causing me to lose sleep these last couple of nights in a good way. And I feel like it's a burden in my heart. God, what is the faith yes here? Is this the moment to lean in and say yes, but only God can do it? I don't know if you have a faith yes in front of you. My hope is that you will look to God and say, when I get 20, 30 years past this, or 10 years past this, or even a year past this, I'm going to look back and say, I am so glad I said yes, even though it didn't make sense. My hope is that you will pray and consider. And here's where I said the connect cards are going to come into play. So hopefully you've already put on your prayer or praise request on there. But I want you to put, I am praying for more faith in fill in the blank. You don't have to put your name next to this if you don't want me to know that. But I think for us, for you, maybe you even need to keep the card. You don't have to turn it in. I am praying for more faith in this. If you will answer this, you'll put your faith yes down. I believe that something could start changing in your heart. I'm not asking for the excuses why you can't. I'm wanting you to say, this is my faith, yes. And we don't even meet this nobleman ever again. But his faith, yes, was travel 20 miles, hope for the best, hope I encounter Jesus. I did encounter Jesus. I don't know what he was expecting. I'm doubting he got the answer he thought he was going to get. I'm sure he thought he could show his notoriety and Jesus would just follow him home. But he didn't. He expected Jesus to come, and Jesus asked him to go. What is Jesus asking you to go do? Now, this is some scary stuff, but it's also kingdom scary, which I think is exciting. And some of us will say, Keith, I'm not wired like you. Good, because you're going to have a faith, yes, that's way different than mine. And that's good. But what I want us to do, and I didn't prompt the worship team to do this, so if you could, let me look at the worship set and remind myself which songs. If you could redo one of the songs for me. Be the center, if we could.